In the mid-1950s, life in the hollers of Appalachia was defined by hard work, close-knit communities, and deep poverty. Imagine a winding gravel road cutting through mist-shrouded mountains, tiny clapboard houses perched on steep hillsides, and fields of corn struggling to grow in thin soil. Medical care was often a day's walk away, and public services like child welfare agencies barely existed. For families scraping by on meagre farm wages or seasonal labor, every dollar mattered, and every mouth to feed felt like one too many. Children were expected to pitch in however they could. At dawn, small hands helped gather eggs before walking several miles to a one-room schoolhouse. At dusk, they hauled water from a spring or gathered firewood for the evening's meal. Education often ended at the fourth or sixth grade. Beyond that, it was assumed a child would remain home to help with chores or go to work, whether in the tobacco fields or as an informal caregiver for younger siblings. When your entire extended family lived under the same roof, grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, privacy was all but non-existent. And for a little girl born into such a world, childhood could disappear faster than a cornstalk in a late frost. Back then, the idea of child protection as we know it today simply wasn't part of most people's vocabulary. There was no formal child protective services with a toll-free hotline. If whispers of abuse reached the local minister or a kindly school teacher, the typical response was to appeal to family elders or church elders to sort it out quietly. Reporting a relative to any outside authority was considered scandalous, something you did only as a last resort, and even then it risked tearing the community's social fabric. It wasn't until 1974 that the United States Congress passed the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, CAPTA, setting the first federal guidelines for identifying, reporting, and investigating child abuse. CAPTA required states to establish procedures for mandatory reporting by professionals like teachers, doctors, and social workers, and it offered federal funding to bolster those efforts. Before CAPTA, many states had only rudimentary or voluntary systems, and the idea of reporting your own mother or grandmother would have been unthinkable, both culturally and legally. Decades later, with the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, TVPA, in 2000, our legal framework expanded to recognize and prosecute the commercial sexual exploitation of children as a form of human trafficking. TVPA provided tools not only to punish offenders, but also to support survivors through access to social services, shelter, legal aid, and vocational training. Under today's laws, a 7-year-old being sold into forced labor or sex work would trigger a federal investigation, and caregivers could face decades in prison. But in rural Kentucky of the 1950s, none of these protections existed. That historical gap allowed cycles of abuse to go unchallenged for generations. A grandmother who believed that her own survival depended on sending her granddaughter to help out at a neighbor's farm faced no risk of criminal charges, and the child victim was taught to keep the secret or risk starvation and worse punishments at home. The entire system, legal, social, economic, conspired to silence her. It's easy looking back to point fingers at that grandmother, or at a culture that prioritized family privacy over child welfare. But we also make mistakes today that echo those old patterns, assuming it's a family matter. Even now, many neighbors hear arguments, see bruises, or notice a child's anxiety, but hesitate to call a hotline because they fear breaking up a family. We think maybe it was an accident, or they'll work it out. That hesitation can cost a child precious time to get help, relying solely on professionals. We believe that if a child doesn't tell a teacher or a doctor, then everything must be fine. Yet research shows that fewer than 1 in 3 abused children ever disclose abuse to professionals. Friends, neighbors, and relatives are often in the best position to notice and act. Believing shame prevents disclosure. We tell victims, you must speak up without understanding the shame, fear, and loyalty that keep them silent. Threats from abusers. If you tell no one will believe you and your family will starve, still echo in many survivors' minds. Underestimating the role of economics. Poverty remains a powerful driver of exploitation. Families under financial stress may still see a child's labor as a necessary sacrifice, or traffickers may prey on vulnerable communities. We can't simply arrest offenders without offering viable alternatives for families in crisis. So what lessons can we carry forward? Community responsibility. Every one of us, whether neighbor, teacher, pastor, or grocery store clerk, shares a responsibility to watch for warning signs and to learn how to respond. Making a single phone call to Child Protective Services or a local shelter can start the wheels of help turning. Accessible reporting. Ease of reporting is crucial. States now have toll-free hotlines and anonymous online forms. But we still need public education campaigns, posters in schools and training for non-professionals, so that everyone knows how and when to reach out. Empowering children. Teaching children their rights and giving them language to report abuse is fundamental. Age-appropriate programs in schools that explain, "My body belongs to me," or "Tell a trusted adult if I feel unsafe," can break the cycle of silence. Holistic support. Legal action against abusers must be paired with support for victims' long-term recovery. Trauma-informed counseling, safe housing, financial assistance, and educational opportunities. Without these, survivors often struggle to rebuild their lives. By understanding the harsh realities of Appalachia in the 1950s and the evolution of child protection laws, we can see both how far we've come and how far we still have to go. When the legal system, community networks, and economic supports come together, no child should ever feel that staying silent is the only way to keep their family fed. And every adult should know that protecting a child is worth any temporary discomfort, because childhood once lost can never be reclaimed. In the mountains of eastern Kentucky, stories of hardship and perseverance are woven into every family's memory. But there's a darker thread that sometimes passes from one generation to the next, the belief that survival justifies cruelty. For Zelda's grandmother, Josephine, that belief wasn't born out of malice so much as desperation, and a family tradition of thinking that women are meant to suffer. To understand how a child could be sold by her own grandmother, we need to look beyond individual cruelty and seek the invisible hand of multi-generational trauma. Josephine's own childhood was marked by an unrelenting struggle. Born in the early 1900s, she grew up in a sharecropper's cabin so small that her crib was made of whiskey crates. Her mother had a thin voice from years of coughing over the wood stove. Her father was killed in a mining accident before she turned 6. With her brothers off at war or patching together seasonal work, she spent long days plucking tobacco leaves while hungry. When she was 12, her own grandmother arranged for her to stay with a neighbor for a week of helping out, a polite phrase for the systematic exploitation of a child's labor and body by men twice her age. There was no lawyer to complain to, no agency to report it. Josephine was told to keep quiet, or the family would lose the meager support that kept them alive. That story became Josephine's secret inheritance. She buried it under years of scorn for weakness, teaching herself that feelings are for fools, and later, when she ran out of options, she repeated the same pattern with her granddaughter. In her mind, she was offering Zelda a chance to feed the family. The money she collected bought flour, salt, a bit of bacon, and the whiskey that numbed her own memories. It never occurred to her that she was destroying her granddaughter's life, because nobody had ever saved hers. This is the essence of transgenerational trauma, when unhealed wounds in one generation are passed on through behavior belief systems and silence. It happens in families around the world, from Appalachia to Afghanistan. An alcoholic father sees no alternative to drowning his grief in booze. His children learn that pain must be numbed, not addressed. A community that hides sexual abuse inside the church teaches its girls that secrecy is safety, and silence keeps the family intact. The trauma accumulates like layers of sediment until someone strikes bedrock and a violent crack ripples upward. In our modern understanding of psychology, we know that trauma can change gene expression, making subsequent generations more prone to anxiety, hypervigilance, and depression. It can reshape neural pathways so that even infants pick up on a caregiver's stress hormones. That's why you'll sometimes see siblings raised in the same household respond differently. One child internalizes the fear, the other acts out in rage. Yet both carry the same story encoded in brain and body. A recent study of families in rural Virginia, published by the University of Richmond, found that households with 3 or more generations of unaddressed domestic violence had a 40% higher rate of psychological disorders among grandchildren compared to families where abuse had been interrupted by external support. In practical terms, that means a single compassionate intervention, whether by a teacher, a counselor, or a neighbor, can break the chain and give a child permission to heal instead of endure. But breaking that chain requires recognizing the invisible rules that keep it in place. We don't air our laundry in public. In many tight-knit communities, gossip can travel faster than the mail. Families believe that keeping secrets about abuse prevents shame, yet concealment only entrenches power. When the Smiths of Johnson County refused to let their neighbors intervene, their children learned that pleading for help would only bring disgrace, so they learned to suffer in silence. Authority begins at home. Elders are expected to be obeyed. If grandma says it's for the good of the family, then resisting her is tantamount to treason. Without another adult stepping in to challenge that authority, a vulnerable child has nowhere to turn. We see this pattern in immigrant communities as well, where cultural tradition gives older relatives unchecked power over young lives. Love equals sacrifice. When a mother or grandmother says, "I do anything for you," they sometimes mean, "I'll sacrifice your safety for your survival." Love becomes entangled with exploitation. Children interpret that sacrifice as proof of affection, confusing harm with care. It's a cruel irony the people who claim to protect you become the source of your deepest wounds. Silence is safety. Threats are a currency of control. If you tell "I'll kill your mother," words spoken to 7-year-old Zelda weren't idle. They reinforced the idea that any attempt to speak out could result in worse violence. For a child, silence often feels like the only protection. So how do we counter these invisible forces? How do we loosen that choking grip of history so that one generation doesn't doom the next? Model open communication. When neighbors share concerns with one another without judgment or blame, they create a network of vigilance. A Kentucky teacher, Miss Lorna, once noticed Zelda's drawings change from sunlit barns to dark, crowded rooms. In a community where reporting to authorities was taboo, she approached Zelda with compassion. "I'm here if you ever need to tell me anything." That simple invitation planted a seed of trust, even if Zelda didn't use it at the time. Empower alternative voices. Children often feel they must be loyal to their abusers. We can offer them another allegiance, the friendship of a coach, the mentorship of a church youth leader, or the consistent support of a home health nurse. When that adult listens and takes action, the child realizes that not all grown-ups are dangerous. Teach generational literacy. Families rarely talk about their own childhoods. By encouraging parents and grandparents to share their stories, difficult as they may be, they demystify the past. In therapy groups across Tennessee, facilitators ask elders to recount a challenging moment in their youth, Then they trace how that moment influenced their parenting. Just naming the pattern breaks its power. Provide economic alternatives. Poverty isn't an excuse for abuse, but it is an enabler. Families under financial strain are more vulnerable to exploitation. Community organizations that offer job training, cash assistance, and affordable childcare reduce the temptation to trade a child's labor, or worse, for money. A program in West Virginia that paid $300 per month in family relief grants saw a 25% drop in reports of child neglect within 2 years. Normalize help-seeking behavior. We applaud victims for their courage, but often in private. Publicly celebrating stories of survival through local newspapers, church bulletins, or school assemblies sends a clear message. You will be believed. You will be supported. That cultural shift makes it easier for the next child to come forward. When Zelda finally escaped her grandmother's grasp, she carried with her not only the scars of abuse, but also the unspoken trauma of her elders. It was a burden no 7-year-old should bear. Yet she survived in part because a few kind souls, Miss Nancy, Miss Florence, refused to accept her fate as normal. They recognized that Josephine's cruelty was born of her own shattered childhood, and they treated Zelda not as property, but as a person. Breaking a cycle that began decades earlier was no small feat. Zelda's journey shows us that healing must address both the present wounds and the ancestral echoes that shape families. When we focus solely on punishing offenders, we miss an opportunity to reform the systems that enabled them. And when we ignore the children of tomorrow, we risk passing our unhealed trauma along once more. The true measure of progress isn't just how many offenders go to prison, it's how many children today learn they deserve compassion instead of suffering. It's how many parents choose to share their stories rather than hide them. And it's how many communities vow that never again will a child be left to endure abuse in silence. When Zelda suddenly felt her grandmother's grip tighten and heard that chilling threat, "If you don't do what I say, you won't eat again," something ancient and primal stirred inside her. At 7 years old, she had learned fear like a language, but she had also absorbed the instinct to survive. On that afternoon alone in a creaking farmhouse with a stranger's leering eyes, her body chose fight over freeze, and that choice changed the course of her life. She'd been brought into a dimly lit bedroom under the pretense of doing women's work. The man's heavy boots thudded on the wooden floor as he closed the door behind them. Zelda's heart thundered in her chest and an icy panic spread through her limbs. In previous visits, she had whispered and begged, her small frame trembling. But this time, her tears hardened into determination. When he reached for her, she yanked free and bolted for the door, but it was locked. For a moment, doubt flickered in her mind. What if the lock held? What if he caught her? But the terror of being trapped was stronger than the fear of running into the unknown. Zelda flung herself against the door, heard the wood splinter, and felt the latch give way. She burst into the hallway, naked and bleeding, her small feet pounding the floorboards. She didn't pause to grab her clothes. She only knew she had to get away. The old farmhouse was a maze of shadows and empty rooms, but Zelda had wandered its corridors before, always under her grandmother's watchful eye. Now she used that memory to navigate left at the kitchen, past the back stairwell, through the narrow doorway that her grandmother had once shown her as a shortcut. She sprinted across the yard, the world spinning around her. Above her, the late afternoon sun strained through clouds. Ahead, a battered truck sat under a maple tree. She vaulted into the truck's bed and crouched behind the rusted toolbox, pressing herself flat and holding her breath. Minutes later, she heard the man's fury shouts, pounding footsteps, the car door slamming. She waited until his bootsteps receded, then slipped out of the truck and ran downhill toward the dirt road. Each step bit into her raw flesh. But pain was an old companion pain she understood better than fear itself. When the night air claimed her, she followed a faint light on the horizon, a small roadside chapel where travellers sometimes paused to pray. Inside the pews rose in neat rows, and the stained glass windows glowed with twilight colours. Zelda collapsed in a corner, her body heaving with sobs that were part relief, part shock. In that hushed sanctuary, she first realized that running had not brought her to safety, only to a new kind of waiting. The chapel offered no warm bed, no kind face, only silence, and the occasional drip of water from a leaky roof. She spent that night curled around her own knees, drifting in and out of consciousness. In her dreams, she ran across fields of fire, always trying to outrun her grandmother's voice. In her waking moments, her mind fractured into fragments, a 7-year-old girl screaming a shadowy man, the lock, breaking the chapel's wooden floor. By morning, she felt as if her soul had unraveled into 1,000 pieces. But morning came, and with the light came the first genuine stirrings of hope. Zelda heard the rumble of a car and cringed, but instead of angry shouts, she heard gentle footsteps and a woman's soft voice. "Child, are you there?" the voice called. "I saw you run in. Please come out." Zelda's instincts screamed that any adult could be dangerous, that trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. But something in the tone warmth, laced with concern, pulled her forward. She crept out from behind the altar, her head down, tears staining her face. The woman knelt beside her and held out a handkerchief. She was older, her hair white, her skin lined but still strong-looking. She carried a small grocery bag and wore a simple cotton dress. Zelda's first thought was a kind woman, but kind women usually stayed away from brambles and secrets. This one had come looking for her. "Here," the woman said. "My name is Miss Florence. You're safe now. Let's get you into clean clothes." She wrapped Zelda in a shawl from her bag, led her to the car, and drove without question to a small farmhouse a few miles away. There she cleaned Zelda's wounds with gentle care. Warm water, soft cloth, herbal salve, and spoke in low whispers. "You did the right thing by running. You deserve better." She never asked for a single detail of the abuse, never shamed Zelda for what happened. Instead, she offered rest food and an unfamiliar word. "You're not alone." In the days that followed, Zelda learned about other women like Miss Florence women in Kentucky and Missouri who ran informal safe houses. Some were faith leaders, others were retired nurses. They formed a loose network called the Appalachian Safe Harbor, passing vulnerable children from one home to the next until a permanent solution emerged. They had no official funding. They relied on donations of food blankets and a quiet phone line. And they made it their mission never to turn away a child in flight. At one of these safe houses, Zelda met Miss Nancy, a wiry woman in her 60s. Miss Nancy lived alone on a hilltop farm where she harvested medicinal plants. She taught Zelda how to brew chamomile tea for her stomach and lavender oil to soothe her sleeping mind. But more importantly, she listened. Each evening, Zelda sat on the porch with Miss Nancy and watched the sun bleed into the mountains. The two of them talked about simple things, zinnias in bloom the color of robin's eggs, the shape of clouds. No one ever asked Zelda to recount her nightmares, but she began to dream of those zinnias of purple petals shining in twilight. Her mind found refuge in ordinary beauty. Miss Nancy also wove in lessons about safety, how to dial 911, how to describe her surroundings, how to find an exit in any building. She taught Zelda that a child's body was her own, that no one had the right to touch her without permission. It was radical advice in a world where obedience was drilled into every child as the highest virtue. Other children came through Miss Nancy's farm, some escaping neglect, others fleeing violent homes. Zelda watched as two siblings, barely 10 and 8, arrived one night, clutching a single ragged teddy bear between them. They shivered on the porch, terrified to step inside. Miss Nancy knelt before them and said, "You're safe here. We'll help you figure out what to do next." Their stiff backs loosened and they walked in. Over time, Zelda realized that survival wasn't just about running, it was also about finding someone who would catch you when you fell. A safe house could offer not only shelter, but the start of a new story. One where the child was more than a victim, where her choices mattered. But not every refuge was perfect. Zelda heard stories of shelters that locked children in rooms for their own protection of caretakers, who saw the children as burdens, not blessings. She learned that some adults claimed to help, but insisted on controlling every aspect of a child's life, what they ate, who they spoke to, where they could go. Those weren't safe harbors, they were cages disguised as sanctuaries. From Miss Nancy and Miss Florence, Zelda learned how to spot a healthy refuge voluntary care. Children must be free to leave the common area. Locked doors signaled danger, respect for autonomy. Caregivers asked consent before any medical care or conversation about difficult topics. Consistency. The same few adults tended to the children, no rotating staff that felt like strangers. Connection to community resources. Referrals to counselling schools and legal aid meant the child's needs extended beyond a single house. Armed with that wisdom, Zelda moved on to the next step of her journey, finding a permanent home where she could breathe again. But she never forgot the lessons of those safe houses, that bravery could be as quiet as slipping out of a window, and as profound as choosing to trust a stranger's outstretched hand. She carried their names in her heart, Miss Florence, Miss Nancy, and kept an eye out for other runaway children as she grew. Years later, when Zelda opened her own farm clinic, she patterned it on those early refuges. She posted a small sign by the door, "All are welcome, no questions asked," and she never locked it from the inside. When Zelda finally found a permanent home in Cincinnati's St. Mary's Shelter, she realized that healing would require more than a change of scenery. Trauma lives in both body and mind, and unraveling its knots demanded a holistic approach, one that honored the stories of pain while sowing seeds of renewal. Miss Florence and Miss Nancy had taught her the first steps: rest, nourishment, and the power of a listening ear. But now Zelda discovered new tools: structured counseling, physical activity, and creative expression. Each morning she woke before dawn to fetch water and light the stove, learning domestic skills that brought a sense of routine she had never known. By mid-morning she sat in circle with other girls, teenagers, who like her carried secret burdens. A Franciscan nun named Sister Matilda led mindfulness exercises, deep breathing, guided visualization, and gentle stretches adapted from yoga. "We honor this body," Sister Matilda would say, "for it has carried you through storms." In the afternoons, Zelda and her peers attended classes literature, arithmetic, and history. But they also had healing arts once a week, painting, clay modeling, and journaling. Zelda found solace in words scribbling in a battered notebook. "I am not the girl who ran away. I am the girl who found her voice." Her pen scrawled through tears, pain transmuting into poetry. At first, therapy felt foreign. Zelda's instinct was to guard her feelings, to steel herself against fresh wounds. Yet in small groups, when another girl whispered, "I was hurt," too, Zelda recognized her own reflection. She learned that trauma is not a solo load, but a shared burden, and that sharing it can make it lighter. By her 16th birthday, Zelda had completed her GED classes and even helped tutor younger girls who missed school. When a counselor suggested she see a doctor for recurring chest pains, likely psychosomatic from long-held stress, Zelda agreed. A local volunteer physician, Dr. Carter, listened patiently to her story rather than rushing to prescription. He recommended mild anti-anxiety medication alongside breathing exercises and regular walks around the shelter's courtyard. "We treat mind and body together," he told Zelda, "because they speak the same language of healing." On weekends, Zelda volunteered at a small community garden run by the shelter. She learned to plant marigolds and calendula flowers with antiseptic petals and to brew tinctures from their blossoms. She discovered the science behind herbalism, how certain compounds soothe inflammation, how teas aid digestion, and how lavender can quiet a restless mind. Each new batch of salve she mixed carried more than scent. It carried intention. When Zelda turned 18, the rules of the shelter required her to move on, and she did so with a plan. She had saved a little money from odd jobs washing dishes, and had made friends among shelter staff who wrote her letters of recommendation. A local boarding house agreed to rent her a simple room in exchange for light housekeeping. She continued drinking her nightly lavender tea and writing in her journal. But now she added a new ritual each morning. She walked to a nearby riverbank and gathered wild yarrow and elderflower. She dried the herbs on her windowsill and researched recipes in borrowed library books. That is how the Yarrow and Lavender Apothecary began, first as homemade gifts for fellow former residents, then as small sales at the farmer's market. Zelda packaged her creams in recycled glass jars, each bearing a handwritten label. For aching shoulders, or when worries won't let you sleep. She offered samples with a soft-spoken smile. "I made this to help my own restless nights. I hope it helps yours." Word spread slowly but steadily. Neighbors praised the soothing quality of her balms. A local midwife began recommending her teas to new mothers. Zelda realized she was not just crafting products, she was weaving a community of care. The profits, modest at first, went straight back into supplies and a small savings fund. But Zelda refused to grow alone. She looked back fondly on Miss Nancy's farm and Miss Florence's house places that had become sanctuaries because they combined practical support with genuine warmth. She envisioned something similar, but more sustainable, a non-profit centre where women and girls fleeing violence could find both herbal remedies and trauma-informed counselling, educational workshops, and safe housing. With that vision, she reached out to Mr. Augustus, the retired teacher who had lent her books years before. He introduced her to a local social services grant committee. She applied for seed funding under a small community development program. When the application came back with congratulations and a $10,000 reward, Zelda nearly wept. She rented an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, small enough to feel cozy, large enough for a counseling room and an herb-drying loft. She called it Wildflowers Sanctuary. In the front room, counselors met clients. In the back, apprentices roasted chamomile and prepared oils. Upstairs, visitors found 2 spare bedrooms if they needed a night's escape. Zelda hired 2 part-time staff, a licensed social worker and a horticultural therapist who led gentle gardening workshops. Weekly classes ranged from identifying safe touch to herbal first aid, and once a month, a visiting art therapist guided group painting sessions. In the first year, Wildflowers Sanctuary served 47 women and girls, hours fewer than expected, but each case was intense. Zelda recorded outcomes: 35% reported improved sleep within 6 weeks, 50% engaged in follow-up counseling, 20% returned for additional housing stays. Though the numbers were not astronomical, they represented real shifts from terror to empowerment. Along the way, Zelda spotted pitfalls that had troubled other refuge models. Over-reliance on a single funding source. Year 2's grant arrived late, forcing her to pause stipends. Zelda quickly diversified. She added a donation jar at the farmer's market stall, organized a small annual herb and hearth fundraiser, and partnered with a local yoga studio for proceeds-sharing classes. Insufficient staff training. A volunteer without trauma-informed training once breached a client's boundary by pressing for details. Zelda instituted mandatory training on confidentiality consent and cultural sensitivity for anyone paid or volunteer who worked on site. Neglecting aftercare. Some clients left the program without connections to local resources. Zelda now ensured each person left with a healing plan. Referrals to counseling networks, a list of support groups, and a small care package of herbs and instructions. 2 years in the sanctuary had expanded its reach. The local domestic violence shelter began referring clients. The county health department printed flyers for their community centers. Zelda added one more staff member, an outreach coordinator who met survivors where they were in homeless shelters or low-income clinics. By year 3, they had helped 123 women and girls, and surveys showed that 78% felt safer and more hopeful after 6 months of involvement. But beyond statistics, the true measure of success lay in stories. There was Maria, a young single mother, who found relief from panic attacks through chamomile baths. There was Tasha, a teenage runaway who returned to finish high school after joining gardening circles. There was Laura, a war veteran whose trembling hands steadied when she learned to craft lavender sachets. Each of them carried badges of pain-scarred wrists, haunted gazes, tremors at dusk, and each left with a small token of resilience, a sprig of rosemary to plant at home, a journal to inscribe their progress, or a simple mantra, "I am rooted, I will rise." When Zelda looked out over the raised beds of calendula mint and sage behind the sanctuary, she saw more than plants. She saw a map of a journey from fear to trust, from hiding to helping, from silence to song. The work was far from over. Funding cycles still lapsed, new trainees still needed orientation, and fresh scars of violence continued to arrive on the doorstep. But Zelda no longer felt alone in that labor. She had built not just a refuge, but a living system of care, one that honored the lessons of Miss Florence's intuition, Miss Nancy's herbal wisdom, Sister Matilda's compassion, and Dr. Carter's gentle science. She had woven together medical, psychological, educational, and community support into a tapestry of healing, and in that tapestry, each woman found a place to mend holes in her spirit, learn new stitches of strength, and eventually pass on those threads to someone else in need. That Zelda understood was the true power of a holistic model. It transforms survivors into stewards, turning pain into purpose, and roots of trauma into gardens of growth. When Zelda celebrated her 50th birthday, she stood beneath the flowering boughs of the angel's rosebush that Miss Florence had planted decades earlier, and she felt the full weight of her journey. A child once sold by her own grandmother, she had become a steward of healing, a mother, an activist, and now a grandmother herself. The circle of life had come full turn, and she knew that the work of transformation extended far beyond the gates of Wildflower's sanctuary. Over the years, Zelda saw survivors blossom into advocates. There was Tasha, the runaway teenager who had learned to tend the sanctuary's medicinal garden and later went on to earn a degree in social work. She returned every semester to lead workshops on safe listening for friends and families, teaching neighbors how to recognize the signs of abuse: sudden withdrawal, unexplained bruises, nightmares, or repeat truancy. At community centers, Tasha modeled phrases like, "I believe you," "You're not alone," and "What do you need right now?" Simple words that few of Zelda's generation had heard when they were growing up. Then there was Maria, the young mother whose panic attacks had once confined her to her bedroom at the first sign of loud voices. After months of chamomile baths and group therapy, she found her voice in the state legislature, working on bills to increase funding for rural mental health clinics. She invited Zelda to speak at a hearing on trauma-informed care, and when Zelda testified about Appalachian Safe Harbor's early days, passing secret phone numbers on scrap paper, committee members murmured in disbelief that such underground networks ever existed. At each success, Zelda felt a mix of pride and caution. She knew that even well-intentioned advocacy could falter if it overlooked the realities survivors faced. When a national non-profit proposed opening a healing center in the region, promising celebrity endorsements and glossy brochures, Zelda warned the board, "Don't parachute in without listening first. If you build it for donors instead of survivors, it will sit empty." She helped them revise their plan, adding survivor-led design sessions, sliding scale fees, and an anonymous feedback system. Zelda also watched her own children carry the torch. Naina, the eldest, became a psychologist specializing in post-traumatic growth. Her office walls were lined with certificates, but also with rocks she'd collected on hikes with her grandmother. Tangible reminders of grounded strength. Matthew, the middle child, applied his expertise in agronomy to sustainable farming programs in refugee camps, teaching displaced families how to grow healing herbs in harsh climates. And Claire, the youngest, earned her nursing degree and opened a mobile clinic that brought trauma-informed care to women in rural Alabama. Together, their family formed a quiet network of support, each member using their gifts to interrupt cycles of violence far from Kentucky. Yet they never lost sight of the small things: Sunday dinners around Zelda's farmhouse table, where conversations ranged from herbal salves to legislative strategy. Bedtime stories beneath the old oak, telling grandchildren how courage can be as simple as running toward help instead of away. But Zelda knew that inspiration alone wasn't enough. True change required personal action at every level, by neighbors, co-workers, and even strangers passing through a drive-through. She often told her audiences, "You don't need a PhD or a non-profit budget to make a difference." At a community fair one September afternoon, she set up a small booth with jars of lavender sprigs and handouts titled 5 Acts of Safe Listening. Curious visitors learned that within their reach were tools like learning the signs. A quick online tutorial could teach anyone to spot early indicators of abuse changes in a child's behavior, unexplained injuries, or sudden fear of going home. Opening the door, inviting a worried neighbor for coffee. "I've noticed you seem upset lately, and I care could break a child's silence." Knowing the numbers. Posting the local child protection hotline on the refrigerator door made it visible when panic strikes. Offering a ride. Driving a young person to a trusted adult or shelter, no questions asked, might be the escape route they need. Sending a note. A small card left on a locker or bedside table. "I believe you. You're not alone." Could be a lifeline on the darkest day. At first, some shrugged, thinking, "That's sweet, but not my problem." But when Zelda shared statistics, 1 in 10 children experiences sexual abuse before age 18, and personal anecdotes like the time a neighbor's kindness saved her life, eyes softened and hands began to take pamphlets. Still, mistakes happened. Zelda heard of well-meaning volunteers who, after rescuing a teenager from an abusive home, insisted on knowing every detail and pressed the young person to testify in court. The teenager, already traumatized, broke down and refused further help. Zelda wrote to the volunteer organization, "Always remember that telling one's story is a choice, not a requirement. Healing happens at the survivor's pace." She also confronted her own missteps. Early in her advocacy, Zelda had spoken passionately about her own escape, expecting tears and gasps. But she realized later that her graphic retelling sometimes re-traumatized listeners with similar experiences. She learned to share only what felt safe. Focus on the choice to run the shelters that welcomed her, the garden that healed her mind, then point to resources for those ready to dive deeper. For communities ready to commit. Zelda advocated for systemic changes. Trauma-informed schools, teachers trained to recognize dissociation and anxiety and to respond with take a break, passes rather than scolding. In one pilot program at Pinewood Elementary, implementing simple gestures like allowing a child to hold a stress ball reduced behavior referrals by 30%. Safe work policies. Employers providing paid leave and confidential hotlines for employees escaping violence. A local factory introduced a freedom leave policy after hearing stories from Zelda's staff, and dozens of workers used it to escape abusive situations without losing their jobs. Community alliances. Coalitions of churches, health clinics, and non-profits sharing data anonymously to map hotspots of reported abuse so that mobile clinics and shelters could be deployed strategically. Zelda helped facilitate a quarterly meeting in her county, and the drop in emergency calls was so significant that neighboring counties adopted the model. Amid all these efforts, Zelda never ceased to emphasize the power of everyday kindness. She pointed out that survivors carry a ledger of every small mercy: a sandwich bought for a trembling child, a gentle word when tears threatened a blanket offered in the dead of night. Those gestures, she reminded listeners, shape the opposite half of the ledger. On the 20th anniversary of Wildflowers Sanctuary, Zelda invited the first generation of survivors, now professionals in their own right, to return and plant new rose bushes alongside the Angel's Rose. Each survivor carried a rose from their childhood bush, symbolizing the continuity of care. When the last shovel hit the soil, Zelda walked to the center of the garden and said, "This is how we heal the world, one life at a time, passing the hand of hope to the next." As she spoke, grandchildren scampered through the beds, their laughter threading around the circle of women. It was the living tapestry of her life's work, the broken made whole, the silenced given voice, the frightened taught to feel safe. If there was one lesson Zelda wanted everyone to remember, it was this: no act of kindness is too small, no person too ordinary to matter. You may not be able to change every law or every institution, but you can change one heart, one home, one child's destiny. When a neighbor thanks her for the lavender sachet she tucked into their care package, she smiles and says, "You did that. You believed they deserved comfort." When a stranger asks for advice at a farmer's market, she leans in and whispers, "Start with curiosity and compassion and follow wherever they point you." When a child reads a pamphlet on her fridge and finds courage to speak up, Zelda imagines that child's future safe, healed, and helping the next person in need. In the quiet moments when she sits on her porch and rocks in the chair Joseph built, she can still hear the echoes of her 7-year-old self running down that dirt road, terrified, bleeding, and determined. But now those echoes ring with a different truth running. Led her to refuge, refuge led her to purpose, and purpose led her to change the world. And so, as the sun dips behind the Appalachian ridges, Zelda smiles, knowing that every day offers a new chance to choose compassion over indifference, action over silence, and connection over isolation. For that is how the next chapter of healing begins.